Well, I wanted to talk about this because I think it's important. And I feel as though it might be a bridge to see for some folks what's going on the other side of the bridge. Perhaps. Perhaps not. You never know. Anyway, I wanted to talk about this because we're coming up on the 3rd anniversary of the George Floyd lynching in America. And it's kind of one of those things that is astronomical in nature. It's no unseen it once you've seen it. And it's something that every American experience. I say it's almost as great in magnitude and in scope as September 11th. Definitely higher in scope than January 6th. And it's up there. Normandy being attacked, Pearl Harbor, it's up there. It's iconic. It's a day that'll live in infamy. May 25th, 2020. We kind of all can remember where we were. It's late May, you all. We're getting ready for summer. A lot of us are starting to hear about this virus called coronavirus. Some of us are taking precautions. Some of us are just twiddling our thumbs, saying they're just scaring us. It's all nothing. It's like the flu. By this time, we've been told 15 days to slow the spread. It's turned into more like a couple of months. But there's hope because our leader is telling us it's going to go away. The heat from the summer will kill it. That's what we're being told by our leader at the time. And we hear something out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, for those of you who don't know, I've been to Minneapolis many times. It's a wonderful city. Very, for the most part, green. They try to be environmental and ride bikes. That's a good thing. And it's really a quiet, kind of sleepy city. But when news of this situation with George Floyd broke out, and what had transpired at the scene, Americans were rightfully angry. Angry that it was allowed to occur, first and foremost. Angry that it did occur, secondly. And angry at the participants who participated in the occurrence. Now, I said at the onset, when this occurred, that a lot of things needed to change because it was a systemic problem. You know, If people don't understand systemic racism, institutional racism, all you have to do is think about George Floyd in America. Because that'll summarize it for you. You know, you just don't get to boiling the noodles as soon as you put the water in the pot. It takes time to boil the water. So Derek Chauvin doing that in Minneapolis meant that the Minneapolis Police Department had been operating in a wrongful, illegal manner for a long time. And the culmination of bad actions long term is very tragic and dire. As George Floyd so awfully had to endure on this side. What we saw was evil. Pure evil. A man with his knee on another man's neck as he pleaded for his life and pleaded to see his mother. And we talk about children, but we are dishonest, some of us, when we talk about children and wanting what's best for our children. Because I want to ask people, and I want them to truthfully be honest, is taking your child to a drag show more detrimental mentally to the child's well-being than them seeing a murder, a lynching on television, in newspapers, on the internet? You know, every child in America saw that. Children were present from the moment as it was happening, screaming for the grown adult to take his knee off of another man's neck. So children instinctively present knew that something evil was occurring, and they tried to stop it. Many people gathered and tried to stop it. And it would only be later that we would learn that there was a wall of police officers who turned with their back towards Chauvin and George Floyd, shouted commands at the audience, the spectators, witnesses, to back up. There is nothing I can think of besides watching those planes go into the tower that was more sick, violent, inhumane. That was the sickest, most inhumane thing. One of the sickest that I've ever seen. You had the dispatcher call her supervisor as she was watching, saying, "Something is wrong here." Everyone instinctively knew it was bad. Everyone. And so that's why I say people are dishonest. some people concerning the well-being of their children. Because those same people haven't turned to their children and asked how they process George Floyd. You know, we're going on the 3rd anniversary. I said that at the onset. How did people process the George Floyd lynching in America? That's a question. And there's a number of answers you can give that question depending on who and what you're talking about. So let's break it down, because I like doing that. Let's take children for example. How did the children, the youth, process, or how have I observed, because I can only speak for myself. You all observe things that I don't necessarily observe, and vice versa. So how I observed the youth processing George Floyd's violent lynching by adults done racially, I observed the youth go out in mass from community to community in this country, demanding reforms to the system. Now, there were a litany of reforms that were demanded. Some were jurisdiction-based, meaning they had particular issues with their jurisdiction where they lived. Maybe their town, their city. You know, we hear about some of the bigger issues that came out of it. Black Lives Matter, critical race theory, police reform, defund the police, back the blue. We hear about those kind of things. But we never hear about the structural, on the micro level of reforms that the youth were calling for. They called for increased observation of law enforcement, and not by other law enforcement in the same jurisdiction. No. They called for oversight by the federal government to come and observe some of these towns, cities, and communities where known racist police officers have been working with immunity, doing all kinds of fuck shit to Black Americans for long periods of time. That was something that the youth were advocating for. I also saw the youth kind of fracture based off into ideology. So you saw a lot of youth activists who became more active in their community based off of issues and policies. And then I saw the counter. And the counter was youth who were upset the social justice issues were being brought up. They were like, there's nothing structurally or institutionally wrong in this country. It just so happened that Derek Chauvin lynched George Floyd for 9 minutes and 22 seconds. Shit happens. Move on. They didn't say that. But that's the impression anyone who was listening to them would have garnered. Now, there were a tiny few that tried to justify. But we're not going to make the tiny few representative of the larger opposition, like they try to do. No, we're going to talk about the two bigger groups. We're not going to talk about fringe folks, because that's often what happens. The fringe folks, they get the loudest bullhorn. And the more sensible, reasonable people who just so happen to disagree, mainly because there's a lack of dialogue, they don't get to share their opinions because they're shouted down by unreasonable folks. We know who they are. Now, shit happens, move on, crowd. First off, this is the first problem in America. Shit's been happening, and they've been telling American citizens to move on. There's a pattern and practice, is what the larger group of youth were saying. Pattern and practice versus isolated incident that always continues to occur based off of race in our country. So there's this argument of denial that it might be bad, but it's not that bad. And I give you the pretext and the context for that commentary. If any of you all want to listen to what the conservative framework or argument was at that time versus the more progressive argument at that time, go and listen to Charlemagne the God and Rush Limbaugh interviewing each other simultaneously in regards to George Floyd and what America should do. It was one of the few productive, albeit no resolution, interviews during that whole time period. There were others, don't get me wrong, but it was a very productive, substantive, and almost truthful dialogue. But when you have the approach that shit happens, get over it. People who have been told to get over it, they tend to get tired of hearing that as well. That angers them. So now they're angry too. Just as angry as the other side that's pissed off and saying shit happens, get over it. And that not only happened with the youth, that happened with all Americans. That, I think, was the central first, second, and now we're at the third anniversary. I think centrally we're still at that stage, that debate, that argument, you all. Because there's been no real dialogue. There's been no real wanting to find solutions. Sure, solutions have been offered. But how legitimate and always criticized are those solutions? You all let me know. So we're still having this argument, you all, about George Floyd and the significance of it. Now, the shit happens, get over it crowd, as I see it, were the aggressors. That's how I see it. And I see it that way, you all, because what happened? One side who demanded reform went out protesting, largely peaceful, all over America. To have that many demonstrations, protests, with that many people, and to really have very few violent protests is amazing. But you all, you look at where the violence happened. Now I want you to really be critical and thoughtful. It happened in the bigger cities, right? In cities larger and similar to Minneapolis. The majority of property destruction that we've heard about. Police involved encounters of violence that we heard about. Now, first and foremost, why do you think that might be? One, we know more people live in cities, so the protests would be larger. And two, the people complaining about reforming their jurisdiction were largely doing so long before George Floyd's lynching. So it would stand to reason that the people who have been told shit happens, get over it, are largely going to be in the cities. And they've largely heard that rhetoric from the governing majority in this country since forever. So this is what I would commonly refer to as a powder keg that went off in America. Sure, some buildings were destroyed, but was that aggressive towards human life? The same way Derek Chauvin violently ended George Floyd's life. If you're telling me destruction of a police station is equivalent to George Floyd being lynched, one, I would tell you, please go and have your head examined. No. So there was this overreaction, in my opinion, from the shit happens, get over it crowd, where they turned to aggression and violence towards people who they didn't want to hear to begin with. Because remember, shit happens, get over it. They're not necessarily sold on social justice, systemic racism, institutional racism. They're not sold on that. So they're frustrated with people who are. And what did they do? The first chance they got during the summer, when we could all go outside and we're trying to deal with what's happened, Ahmaud Arbery being gunned down in cold blood at noon, jogging in Georgia. You know, certain Congress members, this is why, on a side note, gun violence has difficulty moving reforms. Because certain members decide that they only want to bring up the issue whilst people are still grieving. You see, I don't think that's when you should debate and have crucial conversations. When people are grieving, when people are processing. Like we're talking about this now on the third anniversary. It takes time to process. So just like Americans are still processing George Floyd and how they feel, it's going to take time to process when your community is affected by gun violence. So I ask everyone, progressive, conservative, please, when we want to debate a crucial issue, especially when it involves tragedy, can we please minus politics and just focus on healing, processing? We don't have to talk about always the why. In certain cases, we all know why. There's only really a few problems. But it's like anything. They spawn off into little problems on a micro level. When we were all trying to go outside, we're having to deal with Breonna Taylor's apartment being busted open. And an EMT worker, an essential worker during COVID, is murdered by LMPD. Lynched. No reason. Besides, she's a poor, hard-working American in a mostly black area in America. And then we see George Floyd. I always ask conservatives who are like, shit happens, get over it. I always ask them, what do you want the response to have been? Because if everybody had watched that, and it's impossible that you didn't see, hear, or know of it. It's impossible. If everybody had known about it and did nothing, what would that have said about the citizenry? That we're okay with lynching in broad daylight of black Americans again? So it was really, in my opinion, the youth that maybe prolonged America's duration. I'm telling you, if nothing had happened, we'd probably be in worse shape than we are right now. All of those people prognosticating civil wars, well, if the citizenry had broke down along ethnic lines, like they love to predicate on the internet, you probably wouldn't be able to go and grab Starbucks or have anyone deliver it to you. Starbucks probably wouldn't be standing. I don't think people understand the full magnitude of George Floyd. That's why I said it's bad to process and have dialogue right after something happens. This is true in our everyday life. When you get into an argument with someone, directly and completely after the argument, do you want to go and have a conversation about the argument? No. So it takes time to process. In 3 years, I think Americans have processed somewhat. But like I said, we're still at the same area. There's no George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. We've seen countless, at this point in time, other bad, egregious, atrocious acts by law enforcement all across America in different jurisdictions towards Black Americans continue. So at this point, all of us have to wonder, is there really a solution? Or is this going to devolve into something that's really, really ugly for all of us? Now, the only way I see that really happening is if we're not honest. Because if we're honest, we're going to eventually, at some point, get to the bridge and say, hey, there might be a solution. But if we can't even begin to step on the bridge, we can't meet halfway. You know, there's no real going halfway with certain extremes. People that thought it was a joke and did reenactments of the brutal lynching of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, those type of Americans, I really don't feel that they're American. Because you would have to say that someone operating under the guise of serving and protecting the citizenry can also brutalize and take constitutional rights away from another citizen. And the reason I say that's un-American is because if one person can take your constitutional rights away from one American, another can come along and take them away from you as an American as well. And so it's un-American. And for so many Americans to have paid homage and even tried to defend Derek Chauvin's actions, they're deplorable. Look, it's easy and it's honest to toss away something that you know is trash. Americans, we're at the 3rd anniversary. We like to hoard a lot of things as Americans. We collect things. All of us. We don't like to give things away. Throwing things away is difficult. Don't you know we can repurpose, compost? But that's changing something from one form to another to be more sustainable. We just keep clutter. And you know, with trash, it begins to have a smell. It has a stench. And then it grows in smell and scope. You might see parasites start to grow on things. What I'm saying is it gets progressively worse in nature if you don't remove trash. And before we have any dialogue, I think it's incumbent on people who said shit happens, get over it. You might not want to associate with people who think that it's a good idea to do lynchings in America. So you probably should sever ties with them if you want to have people have a dialogue. This is just common sense. We have to be able to remove smelly trash. They're stinking up the place for all of us. Because it's causing damage to all of our health with those types of people. And we see them pop up from event to event. If they're not being openly racist, they're being openly anti-Semitic. Nazi flags. Doing salutes. Real repugnant behavior. And like I said, they're a tiny minority. But people don't want to get rid of the trash. We kind of like it a bit trashy, is what Americans are saying. Well, all I'll say in my observation on the 3rd anniversary, the trash is starting to pile up. And there's beginning to be shortages of workers who want to remove it. You read between the lines as to what I'm saying. Smart people understand. Really, really smart people understand. Dumb people, not so much. George Floyd had a counterfeit, supposedly $20 bill. I don't know if they ever made the determination as to whether it was counterfeit or not. But the store clerk thought it was. Now, people will get all upset about this. But it's another tentacle in this whole thing. Currency. Now, the $20 bill might or might not have been counterfeit. If there's no physical currency, it's only digital, then what's going to be the holdup? So you have some people saying, no, we shouldn't have a digital currency. But something as small as $20 in America in 2020, on May 25th to be exact, got George Floyd lynched in Minneapolis. You have to think about it like that too. And Americans don't want to do any hard labor anymore. Physical, mental, they're checked out. They say crime is up. Well, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. Americans chose a criminal to be their president previously. And then we saw law enforcement officers all across America breaking laws. Murder, destruction, rape. So I said to anyone at the time, what do you expect the citizenry to do? I said, you have to feed the rats. I wasn't calling the citizens rats. Some people will say that. I'm saying this as an analogy. That when you try to starve out the people, of course they're going to commit crimes. A lot of the crimes you're seeing in cities that people want to crack down on are the result of those same people starving the cities of their adequate resources, of their adequate funds. Yes. Look, and we're going to talk about this extensively. There was a war in the cities in 2020 all across America. And the real reason there was a war in the cities in 2020, 2021, 2022 is because there has been war waged on the cities. Yes. Americans, you don't know this, but there's been a long-standing hidden war on American cities by our own fellow citizens who I don't consider to be American because they don't really share American values. And a principle, first American value, is to put all Americans first. Not just white Americans, not just affluent Americans, all Americans. They don't share this principle. So I consider them un-American. And I don't know how they can say I'm un-American when they don't even like certain Americans. You know, that's why there was a lot of heat in the cities. People have been feeling the pressure for decades. Decades. Folks like George Floyd in Minneapolis have been neglected. Willfully neglected. Now, we talked about neglect before. Is when something is uncharted to your care that you have to provide as a responsibility. Law enforcement is supposed to serve and protect. They didn't protect George Floyd's very existence. So when you saw ACAB, and you see it everywhere, no matter where you go, where people are, you see ACAB. Because the citizenry know that law enforcement is not protecting it. So they really should redo their whole mission statement. What's the parameter of their existence? People argued on the reform side, said we should defund, meaning reallocate funding that was primarily going to law enforcement at the expense of everything else, only to continue to drain the citizenry. Because in many places like Ferguson, it was the African Americans who were getting the tickets. You know, people have said this, and it's probably true. You go to any municipal court in any large city on a busy day, and you look at where the lines are and who's standing in line. In Ferguson, it was always Black Americans. Out the door. lines around the building to pay driving tickets. While in not so far off neighboring communities, there's nobody. Because what the resources were being allocated for by the police was to go into marginalized and oppressed communities and ticket those individuals who can least afford to pay, who most likely don't have jobs, and who are struggling just to survive and eat. The war on the cities is about not starving to death. Look, George Floyd didn't have $20 in America. Think about this. Some people will say, oh, he was a recovering drug addict. All of us consume drugs. There are millions and millions and millions of Americans who are recovering drug addicts. We have a drug crisis now in our country. So why are conservatives besmudging George Floyd's name when many white Americans are addicted to fentanyl, dying en masse all across the South? See, we talked about karma too. And karma is about what happens because of the universe. So when people talked about George Floyd and made fun of his circumstance, now they themselves are experiencing family members, loved ones, and highly likely themselves being addicted to deadly drugs all across America, in suburbs, rural communities, and cities. No one is being spared from the drug epidemic in America. It's causing mental health crises. Some people say George Floyd was going through a mental health situation. And now the talk all over the Western society is mental health. See, sometimes we also, when we don't dialogue properly, honestly, we miss opportunities to solve problems that could help all of us. Because there's so much disdain for some of us. This is true. This is what I've observed going into the 3rd anniversary. You know, another issue was the issue of reconciliation. Many Americans, by the millions, said that this economic apartheid, as I like to call it, that certain elements of the American government have been running on black Americans in this country. A lot of Americans said that must end, and there needs to be repair done. Now, we're going into the 3rd year, and we started to hear a lot of clamor about restitution and repair. But we haven't done anything. And I said, well, wait a minute. We've got to do something in the cities. We can't keep talking about the homeless crisis is getting worse in the cities and not be honest as to why that's occurring. We can't keep talking about addiction and not be honest about why that's occurring. Now, we might not have all the solutions. I don't think anyone does. But the solutions that have been offered haven't been tried. They're scoffed at. They're said to be radical pet projects. I don't know what's radical about reparations. You know, the Republican Party is kind of in an interesting situation. Minneapolis is governed by the Democrats. And the Republicans claim that they're a party that's known for freeing African Americans, ending slavery. They were formed, as they present themselves, as an abolitionist party, a one-issue party, ending slavery and freeing the enslaved. And now for them to say that reparations is radical, a pet project, they went from being abolitionists to racists. That's the only thing I can think of, you all, because it was their party. It was their president. It was their generals who proposed reparations. This is a fact. It wasn't the Confederacy, that's for sure. And it wasn't the Democrats. That's also for sure. So people like to say the parties didn't switch. Parties don't have to switch. People, when they feel uncomfortable, they leave somewhere. People who were segregationists and racists, when this country was going through another hardship, prior to entry and the Great Depression, certain Americans turned to racism, hatred, and bigotry to offset their woes, their problems, their grief. And that, you all, led to realignment. It was what many Southern white Americans did during the 1930s that led African Americans to flee the South and head north. You know, they always like to say there was no party switch. But how does that work out when there was a great migration? People just migrate for no reason on land that they once owned, had livestock on. They just flee in the middle of the night. So no, there was a lot of tumult and change that occurred. And we saw that in short order and short time from 2020 to present day. A lot has changed. But what hasn't, you all, is systemic racism. Institutional racism hasn't changed. No. There's been some observers and monitors put in place. There's been some penalizing merited out in extreme cases. But what we haven't seen is this country give back to the cities, the citizens, what was stolen and taken from it. You know, when folks come in to any place, and just take, and don't ever give, as is the case in the cities. It leaves people like George Floyd hungry, and it leaves millions of Americans in the city hungry. That's why we have a homeless crisis. Because there's plenty of people who come and take from the city, take jobs, and then they send that money, those resources, back to communities where they live. And oftentimes, it's not the cities. It's suburbs, exurbs, rural communities. You know, we've all been seeing it and observing it. We see folks with fancy big Ford F-150s. And they don't have license plates in our city. They're from outside the city. But then you go to the city where all the revenue is generated. And we're driving around in beat up 1994 vehicles. How is it, Americans, that folks who generate all the revenue in the cities have the least amount of revenue, and folks where they live, in suburbs, exurbs, where there are no jobs, no revenue hardly, have all the good possessions, the big homes, the big vehicles? It's because of theft. They steal from the rich. Well, not really. We're not rich in the city. They steal the richness of the city, our resources. And then, like settlers of Catan, they take it out to settle the suburbs. This is the war in the cities. The war on the cities. And George Floyd was a victim to this war, as millions of Americans are every day, every year, to this war in the cities. It's a war that no one likes to talk about. It's hidden in plain sight. But like they say, hindsight is 20/20. We all saw it. What they did to George Floyd. And we're never going to forget. And you know what? In the cities, in the end, we're going to win. I keep telling people they're trying to starve us out, the Hunger Games. George knew what they were trying to do. They've done this before. Time and time again, they do this to us. Try to starve us out. But we're not going to starve out. We're not going to accept lynchings of our citizens. And we're going to get what's duly ours. You know, the 3rd anniversary is coming up of George Floyd. If we get to the 3rd anniversary and nothing is really changing systemically, I'm telling you, it's going to be reindeer's games out there. See, they think it's going to just be me. Well, was it just George Floyd? Or was it all of us that were impacted? It's not going to just be me. It's going to be all of us. And I think there's more of us than it is the deplorables. The people who are truly un-American and don't care about all Americans, but say they love a country. They didn't show love to George Floyd, now did they? Was that love they showed to Breonna Taylor? Is it love they've shown to folks who had highways and byways constructed as artichokes to cut off their substance and resources? No. George Floyd was a flashpoint that we all saw bright because there was many structural failures that we couldn't see underneath. It's like the iceberg when the Titanic hit it. Everybody said the Titanic was an unsinkable vessel. Everybody says America is the greatest nation on earth. But the Titanic continued to take on water. A huge vessel, you all. This thing is mammoth and galactic. And slowly, as more water continued to fill the boat, inch by inch, it continued to sink. Empires collapse, you all. Rome, Ottoman, USSR. Dynasties go down. And this happens when you try to not govern for all your people. And Americans, we don't govern for all Americans. We know this. George Floyd exposed this. We saw the neglect at the governmental level. And it persists. And now, certain people on the conservative side have said that their main issue is you for bringing up the problem and for bringing solutions. They say that that's a culture war. And they're waging a war on the culture. Ask them which American culture do they dislike and they want to wage a war on. They'll say it's traditional values. Well, traditionally, people like George Floyd have been mistreated, neglected, abused, wronged. Are those the traditional values they want to keep in place? It sounds like to me they're trying to justify keeping in place institutional and systemic racism under the guise that these are traditional values that made America somehow great. No, it made certain Americans wealthy. Other Americans had atrocities committed towards them at the expense of other Americans' wealth. Translation, it was blood money. $20 George Floyd died over. Who's on the $20 deal? Oh, I dare not say I might get accused of being a critical race theorist if I point out the full and entire story. That slavery did occur in America. And presidents did enslave Americans. So this is this dishonesty we find ourselves in a quagmire in. The certain Americans 3 years later don't want to do anything. They've moved on from it's not a big deal, get over it, shit happens. They're at the stance of we don't want to do anything about it. And other Americans are like, no, there are solutions and we need to act. They want to do something about it. The crowd that says we don't want to do anything about it. Make no mistake, that means keeping systemic and institutional racism in place. Knowing that a problem exists and not wanting to acknowledge it is like what they did with COVID. They said it's just the flu when they knew that it wasn't just the flu. So we already know that reality bends and skirts towards their delusions, regardless of what that reality truly is. Remember they talked about alternative facts? You all remember the previous administration talked about alternative facts? Yeah. This war on the city. If George Floyd is really going to be remembered as really being monumental, a patriot, saving this nation, then there should really be, in my opinion, a range of legislation addressing George Floyd. You know, policing was one component of what we saw. Economic disparity was another component of what we saw. Civil rights was another component. Poverty was another component. We saw a range of components. So there should be a range of legislation. It shouldn't just be policing reform. Where's the economic restitution? Where's something to alleviate poverty? Unhoused individuals. You know they talk about drug addiction. And they say that a lot of unhoused people are substance abusers. Would any of these Congress members like to trade places with anyone living in a tent on a sidewalk and see if that doesn't create some type of substance abuse depending on the duration of the length you have to live that way? Would they care to try it? They say something about not throwing stones at glass houses. They did a movie, Trading Places. Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd. You all should go and watch it. Dan Aykroyd had a lot of money and was doing well. Eddie Murphy, he did. He was poor. But when they changed places, their attitudes also changed. You see, poverty created criminality. Americans know this. If you languish in poverty, you're most likely to commit some type of thing that the U.S. government classifies as a crime. Substance abuse is the easiest one. People who consider themselves reputable in the society, we've seen often abuse alcohol. So why is it a big deal when unhoused people do the same? Because people can see it and they know why it occurs. Not in all cases, but in many. Where is the range of legislation to address what occurred to George Floyd? That's what people, by the millions in the cities, were calling for. Reimagining, as many would say, different confines of systems that have been oppressive and marginalize people in many jurisdictions, if not all, in America throughout its existence. This is what people were advocating for. And conservatives have come back tweaked around the edges and said, well, we're not going to be so openly racist, but we're going to still be racist, increase the bigotry, and expand the hatred. Look, we're going into the 3rd anniversary of George Floyd, and the best most southern states have to offer is banning drag shows as legislation. With all the racial tension in Mississippi alone, in Tennessee alone, and the best they can do is find maybe like 300 people to try to strip away their resources and incomes in predominantly large metropolitan cities. This is really the best they can do. Expand hatred and bigotry. Continue racism. And see, this is what people are tired of. So now you're really seeing folks duke it out. Charlottesville was before George Floyd. We all knew where this was going, because this has been a long-term problem. There are a lot of Americans that resort to racism when they go through tough economic times. That's always historically been the case. That's why we see the rise of Karens. That's why we see militias like the Proud Boys, 3%ers, Oath Keepers. It was the simultaneous effect of President Obama being elected and a global recession in 08, 09. And what happened? You got the Oath Keepers the minute, probably the second former President Obama put his hand on the Bible and took the oath of office. So you have this insidious halo of negative energy all around this country. And it's there in large part because of our treatment to our citizens, our neglect of our citizens, our disdain for our own citizens. Try as they might, the CCP party didn't lynch George Floyd. They didn't kick in Breonna Taylor's door. And they didn't shoot Ahmaud Arbery in broad daylight. Mexico did not give the recent Nashville shooter an AR-15 either. So when I hear people blaming the southern border for their jurisdictional issues and problems, you know those people don't want to solve the problem. They don't want to be honest. They don't want to be honest. You know, we as citizens, we can't let a small minority of tragically our own citizenry starve out many of our citizens because of their disdain. Look, I'm going to focus a lot of attention on Mississippi because I'm telling you, just like what happened with George Floyd, Mississippi is a powder keg that's really gone off, and nobody has quite noticed it yet. Minneapolis is the same way, as many cities are. They're struggling, as many residents are, like George Floyd. And it's been this way for so long that folks have given up in large part on things getting better. But I think the cities are going to get what's due to them. You know, George Floyd's death was not in vain. We're slowly creeping up that hill. We're going to get up to the top. And then it's going to come rolling down. And it's going to benefit all of us. We've just got to get up there. And we as a citizenry are going to have to make some noise. We're going to have to put some people in their place. That doesn't have to be violence, you all. That can be done easily through involvement. You know, a lot of people in Mississippi don't know who their state senator is. Don't know that their state senator can enact laws for their local jurisdiction that can take their rights away, give the state more power over their city. Folks don't know this. They're not told this. But I think once we get more involved going forward, we can see the real change we want to see. We can really do George Floyd the justice he rightfully deserves on this 3rd anniversary.